All right. It's hard for me to call this good evening because the sun is still out. But today we are having our first economics seminar of the semester with Dr. Nina Banks. The format for this evening, very simple. I will be introducing Nina Banks, and she will talk more about the topic of the seminar, and then we'll open up the floor to Q&A. You can ask questions in the chat if you want to ask questions in the chat, and based on how much time we have, Jeff will be asking those questions to Nina Banks. But yeah, all right. That's pretty much what's going to happen. So I'll begin. So thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Rochelle Sumner, and I'm the president of the Economics, Equality, and Environment Club here at BMCC. Today, like I just said, we're having our first economics seminar this semester with Dr. Nina Banks. Dr. Nina Banks is an associate professor of economics at Bucknell University and the current president of the National Economic Association. She's known for her research on the contributions of early women economists, particularly the first Black economist in the United States, Dr. Sadie Alexander. Her other publications focus on social reproduction in migrant households and Black women in work. Dr. Banks is a faculty mentor for the Diversity Initiative for Tenure in Economics program. She serves on the editorial boards of Feminist Economics and the Review of Black Political Economy. She organized the first joint annual Freedom and Justice Conference on the National Economic Association and the American Society for Hispanic Economists. Currently, she's working on several book projects, including a biography and edited volume of the speeches and writings of Sadie Alexander, a manuscript titled Gender, Race, and Environmental Activism, Women of Color Working for Tomorrow, and a co-authored book with Cecilia Conrad and Rhonda Sharp on Black women in the US economy, The Hardest Working Woman. The topic of today's seminar is the economics of Black women's unseen community activism. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Banks.
Thank you, Rochelle. I'm going to share my screen. I'm assuming everybody can see that. Yes, okay. So good evening, and I'd like to thank Rochelle Sumner, the Economics, Equality, and Environment Academic Club, the Department of Social Sciences, Human Services, and Criminal Justice, and the Economics program for inviting me to talk about my research on Black women's unpaid collective work. I'm very happy to be speaking to you this evening, and as I mentioned to Rochelle, this is the only speaking engagement that I agreed to do this semester besides some podcasts. So I'm going to be talking, I'm going to walk you through the main argument of my analysis from the Review of Black Political Economy, and I'll talk about the objective of the research and then give you some specific examples before talking about the intersectional feminist framework that I developed. And this is a project that I have really been thinking about for a very long period of time, and over the last few years have put the pieces together. It comes out of my area of research, which is feminist economics. Feminist economists examine gender disparities between men and women within the formal workplace. And so for feminists envision the workplace, well, the formal workplace is a site where goods and services are produced, workers are paid for their services, and those goods and services are bought and sold through markets. Several decades ago, feminist economists began to argue that the household is also a site of production, and that it is a site where women disproportionately engage in unpaid labor by producing goods and services for other members of the household: cooking, cleaning, laundry, and child and elder care, for example. And so feminists argue that those activities are valuable not just for household members, but they also have social value beyond the household. One of the distinctive things about this important household labor is that it is not compensated. and there's no buying and selling activities. So the way that we think about this household labor is that it is unpaid and it is non-market. But feminists have also said that because we live in a market-based economy, things that are valued often have a price attached to them. And so if we use that logic and think about the work that is performed within the household, then feminists have argued that if we attached a price to the work that is performed within the household, then we could get a sense of the value and the contribution that women disproportionately make to national income, to gross domestic product. So feminists began to think of ways to estimate the value of unpaid household labor as a way of demonstrating women's contribution. And again, I'm going to refer to this as the household approach. So my critique of the household approach is that it does not capture fully the unpaid work that racially marginalized women, or what I refer to as racialized women, often perform for their communities. So I developed a framework for conceptualizing unpaid work that is based on the lived experiences of African American women and our understandings of womanhood and what feminist activism entails. My analysis is part of a very long tradition of feminist critiques of those feminist theories that tend to universalize the experiences of middle-class heterosexual white women. Evelyn Nakano Glenn, Bonnie Thornton Deal, and Teresa Ammett and Julie Mathai are some of the key feminists who have been critical of the tendency to universalize the experiences of white heterosexual women. White and Black women in the United States have different identities as women. This is one of the points that I make in the paper. White women's identities have generally not been shaped by racial oppression, and so their experiences with gender oppression are largely framed around their experiences with men. Feminist theorists Aida Hurtado makes this point by saying that white women's experiences with gender oppression within their homes have led them to develop theories of women's oppression that emphasize private sphere issues between men and women. But my point is that African American women's membership in racially oppressed communities not only shapes our identities as women, but it also provides us with a sense of shared responsibility to a community that exists beyond the private household. For African American women, therefore, our oppression as women is not just a matter of relations between men and women, but also of external matters that affect our community. And indeed, if you think about it, it is not possible to read or to even hear anything about African Americans without the word community attached to it. That's how important the community is to African Americans. And I put a quote up there from Rhonda Sharp, who I understand spoke here last semester. Rhonda Sharp is a very important economist. And she said something to me a few years ago that always stuck in my mind, which is, if I can't see myself in the theory, then there's a problem with the theory. Well, at least that's my interpretation of what she said. She corrected me recently and said that she actually said, if I can't see myself in the data, but for me, it's if you can't see yourself in the theory. And at some point, I could no longer see myself in the theory of the household approach because I was divorced and raising children on my own. In the Review of Black Political Economy article, I developed a broader economic framework for understanding women's unpaid work, again, by placing African American women's experiences at the center of analysis. I have three objectives in this paper, and the first is to reconceptualize the way that we think about community activism as unpaid non-market work. The second objective is to illustrate that the community is a primary site of unpaid collective work for not just African American women, but also other racialized women. And the last objective is to place the community as a site of unpaid production on equal footing with the household as a site of unpaid production. I think I said that. I think I said unequal. So let me say that again. The last objective was to place the community as a site of unpaid production on equal footing with the household as a site of unpaid production. So I'm going to walk you through this flow chart of economic activity that illustrates the invisibility of racialized women's unpaid collective work, or as the word that Rochelle used for to title this talk, unseen work. And unseen is actually a much better way of thinking about that work. So this is a chart of how economic activities are organized in the United States. When mainstream economists talk about how economic activities are organized, they typically refer to production and consumption and buying and selling within the market economy or through the state provision of goods and services. Feminist economists have broadened our understanding of economic activities by arguing that the household is not just a place of consumption, but it's also a site of production that involves unpaid labor. But one of the things that I've noted about the feminist household approach is that there is a lot of emphasis on couples. Now, some heterodox economists focus on a fourth way of producing goods and services, and that fourth way is through the social economy or related frameworks of solidarity or social solidarity economy. The social economy encompasses work that people perform in order to provide for social objectives rather than primarily for the profit motive. Social economy activities often provide for pressing community needs that are not adequately met through the private market sector or through the state's provision of goods and services. So in other words, when we talk about the social economy, we're talking about people coming together. They are engaged in collective action, or they are forming voluntary associations in order to meet the needs of their communities. These voluntary associations can be formal, registered organizations such as cooperatives and nonprofits, right? And when we were talking about the formal registered businesses, then they are engaged in market activities, buying and selling activities. Or the social economy also focuses on activities that are informal and self-help and socio-political, and the members share a common concern around which they organize and mobilize, such as trying to protect the quality of local drinking water. And it's that latter case that I am really focused on, the case of people who are involved in informal, self-help, socio-political associations. Their activities are not only not paid, unpaid, but they are also non-market because there's no buying and selling activity that takes place, right? And so, you know, when I compared these different approaches, especially the social economy and the feminist approaches, what I found is that neither approach paid sufficient attention to the informal work that people are doing. There's no data on salaries or goods and services to be collected. And yet that is work that is often performed collectively by racialized women. And so that's a problem, right? It's a problem if we look at the work that African-American women have historically performed in the United States for their communities. They are performing it, and they have performed it because their communities lack sufficient access to public and private sector resources. And also, and this is also very important, because the public and private sectors have often taken actions that threaten the well-being and the safety of community members. So the purple area on this flow chart is the area that I'm looking at. It's the racialized and gendered, non-market, unpaid work that racialized women have been performing collectively, performing together. Okay, so we're at the end of Women's History Month, on the heels of Black History Month. And so I also want to note that the analysis that I'm doing is only possible because of the work of historians of African-American women, especially women who were involved in the club women's movement and the civil rights movement, and also the important work of sociologists who have theorized African-American women and work. So I want to pay tribute to them before I talk a little bit about my analysis of the history, this rich history that they have documented. So African-American women have historically performed unpaid work for their communities out of a sense of social obligation. Jim Crow segregation and racial exclusion necessitated their work. By 1900, all Southern states had enacted laws to segregate schools for Blacks and whites, and most Northern states provided separate schooling by race as well. Black schools in the South received less funding for supplies, for faculty salaries, and equipment compared to white schools. White people also passed laws that racially segregated buildings, public transportation, and recreational facilities. White privately owned establishments such as restaurants, hotels, clothing stores, and theaters legally banned African Americans. And so in response to government and private sector exclusion, African Americans engaged in collective efforts at self-help in order to develop their own community institutions and provide needed services to help people who lived within those communities. And Black women were instrumental in this effort. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Black women described their non-market community work as racial uplift or betterment. Black women's community uplift activities were heralded by African Americans, while at the same time they were overlooked or unseen by the larger society. W.E.B. Du Bois commented on the importance of Black women's community work in 1924 when he stated that Black women's work received little attention, even though he viewed it as the most effective work in the nation that provided social uplift for the vulnerable. Quote, "The women of America who are doing humble, but on the whole, the most effective work in the social uplift of the lowly, not so much by money as by personal contact, are the colored women. Little is said or known about it, but in thousands of churches and social clubs, in missionary societies and fraternal organizations, in unions like the National Association of Colored Women, these workers are founding and sustaining orphanages and old folk homes, distributing personal charity and relief, visiting prisoners, helping hospitals, teaching children, and ministering to all sorts of needs," end of quote. And since then, since 1924, Black women have continued to engage in grassroots activist work about which, quote, "little is said or known," end of quote. So I'm going to give you some examples of unpaid community work going back to the early part of the 20th century. In 1908, a group of African-American women formed the Atlanta Neighborhood Union, and they did so because they recognized that the city was not addressing the needs of the impoverished African-American community. And so this group of African-American women, Again, they came together, they collected data on community needs so that they could address problems of urban life, again, that city officials were neglecting, such as health services. They were able to provide after-school care. They called attention to and finally got the city to deal with dilapidated housing. They established playgrounds, for example. During the Great Depression, Black women organized the Housewives League in Detroit. I want you to think about the Great Depression as a period where African Americans experienced greater economic disparities than white Americans. Not only because African Americans had higher unemployment rates and larger number of businesses that closed, but also because government policies were not responsive to the needs of African Americans. Government policies had a disparate impact on African Americans. So African Americans were very much left to fend for themselves. And so the Housewives League was a campaign to support Black businesses in order to achieve economic growth and employment. And they were really attempting to try to keep money circulating within the Black community. The Housewives League started in Detroit, but it became a national campaign. And again, it was run entirely by volunteers. This campaign spread to over 25 cities. In 1946, African-American women, professional African-American women, formed the Women's Political Council in Montgomery, Alabama, and they engaged in lots of activities to address disparities that African Americans were dealing with because of racial discrimination. And so they focused on voter registration. They lobbied public officials into taking actions against racial discrimination on segregated buses. They publicized and they launched the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, and they sustained that boycott for almost a year by organizing carpools. The environmental justice movement is currently an area where Black women engage in collective work with the objective of improving the health and safety of community members in response to environmental problems. They are involved as grassroots organizers, as activists, and as leaders in the movement. Black women have been active in fighting against the harmful use of their community's land by city officials and private corporations for toxic waste dumping, for incinerators, and for polluting industries. Landfills have been disproportionately located in Black communities because of their political and economic marginalization. Indeed, many of the health issues affecting poor communities of color are environmental and related to toxic waste dumping, to sewage, to garbage, pests, lead, and poor air quality. Asthma rates for Black children are over 2 times the rates for white children. As with environmental contaminants, there are environmental racial disparities in access to fresh, healthy foods in racialized communities. And consequently, Black women's community justice work addresses both environmental threats and environmental needs. Environmental threats and needs both result from market and state decision-making and actions that affect the well-being of their communities. Examples of Black women's community work include, in the environmental justice movement, include Dolly Burwell. In conjunction with other Black mothers in her community, they helped to launch the birth of the environmental justice movement when they organized as community members in Warren County, North Carolina, in opposition to the use of their land for PCB dumping. Although community members waged an unsuccessful 6-week struggle to prevent the construction of a hazardous waste-filled landfill in their area, their efforts led to the first national mobilization of African Americans against environmental racism. Revealingly, when Worl spoke of the role of mothers in the environmental justice movement, she framed her analysis around Black women's work, stating, "The mothers who struggled for environmental justice in Warren County, North Carolina, struggled in the same tradition and in the same spirit as their foremothers who cooked, fed their children, washed and ironed their clothes, cleaned their house, went to work on their jobs, and still had the commitment and found the time to fight for justice and freedom." End of quote. Worl's statement references Black women's long history of combining caregiving with working outside of their homes and engaging in political activism for the betterment of their communities. Other examples of Black women in the environmental justice movement include Hazel Johnson, grassroots activist and founder of People for Community Recovery in Chicago. Activists regard Johnson as the mother of the environmental justice movement for her challenges to polluting facilities and her lead poisoning awareness and training projects. Doris Bradshaw, president of Defense Distribution Depot of Memphis, Tennessee, Concerned Citizens Committee, led a challenge against the development of 640 acres of contaminated land on a closed military installation in 1996 after she documented the extent to which people in her community were dying from cancer. Belinda Moore formed the Concerned Citizens Crump Neighborhood Association to challenge a chemical corporation's incinerator and hazardous waste landfill in Douglas, Tennessee in 1992. And these are just a few of the many early Black women who were involved in the environmental justice movement. And there is a very long list of Black women activists, many of whom were also poor. Each of these women worked in cooperation with other Black women in their pursuit of environmental justice for their communities. Nonetheless, despite the work that goes into performing community activism, the tendency has been to view Black women's community activism against racial injustice primarily as political rather than as economic. And this has resulted in overlooking Black women's activism as actual work, work that maintains and reproduces material life. Yet Black women's activism involves actual work rather than just politics. And again, it is non-market, unpaid work that takes place within the community. It doesn't take place within the household or within a firm. The unpaid work that goes into collective action and community activism against racial disparities varies depending on the issue around which women organize. It may involve collecting information from community members, organizing meetings, making phone calls to media and elected officials, cleaning garbage from neighborhoods, organizing community patrols, planting seeds and developing community gardens, transporting people to sites of protest or service, registering community members, running awareness campaigns, constructing buildings, monitoring community health, meeting public officials, and cooking food and serving it to community members. And again, similar to the argument that feminists have made with respect to unpaid household production, if these community activities were channeled through the market, that is, if other people were paid to do them, they would be counted as work and their value included as part of national income accounting. These non-market community actions involve the production of goods and services that women undertake in order to achieve social objectives. Community members receive collective benefits from the results of the unpaid work of women activists. Although this analysis has centered on the experiences of Black women's performance of unpaid non-market work, it is generalizable to other racialized women in the US and to countries outside of the US where marginalized women collectively challenge group disparities at the community level. In the paper, in the review of Black political economy, I gave examples of unpaid collective work of Indigenous women in the US, of Mexican American women, and Indigenous women in the Global South, and of Dalit women. And the final part of my analysis is a new framework that elevates the community to a site of production on par with the firm and the household. It provides an intersectional feminist look at women's production of goods and services, both paid and unpaid. This framework allows us to examine women's production of goods and services at the individual level within households and at the collective level within communities. The intersection of gender, race, and class processes within each of these three locations, as indicated by the small blue arrows, reinforces and magnifies women, Black women, and other racialized women's oppression. This framework is useful in thinking through ways in which racialized women experience multiple forms of oppression: exploitation through class processes, domination through control, and exclusion differently, depending on the site and depending on the racialized group in question. Social relations embedded within each of these locations affect relative group positions and outcome. At the community site, Black people live in racially isolated and segregated areas due to racial, residential, and financial exclusions. Black communities experience dominance by both the private and public sectors through their adverse actions and their control over decisions that affect the well-being of community members. This includes, for example, the ways in which Black segregated communities struggle with the unequal distribution of environmental burdens and unequal access to vital resources and services. These racial disparities prompt Black women to perform collective unpaid work to improve social welfare. Their unpaid collective production leads to collective community appropriation and benefits that may include collective goods such as clean air and water, safer neighborhoods, and racial justice. Due to gender norms, Black women disproportionately carry the burdens of collective work. The state exercises dominance and control over Black women activists and community members through policing. The criminalization of Black women results in felony convictions that provide high profits to firms that use extremely low-wage, coerced prison labor. This framework is a starting point for developing a more accurate account of the economic activities that include unpaid work that racialized women perform for their communities. It bridges the analytical gaps within economic theories with respect to non-market unpaid work that women perform collectively. This framework enables us to examine intersectional linkages across different sites of production where multiple intersecting forms of oppression operate in structuring people's lives through overlapping race, gender, and class processes. This approach is preferable to simple additive models of gender and race that do not fully capture the magnitude of racialized women's oppression. Elevating the community to a site of production on par with the firm and the household allows us to examine the microeconomic and macroeconomic impacts of economic changes on women's work. During periods of severe economic crisis or natural disasters or public health crises, women's unpaid community work increases in response to loss of jobs and services. This framework captures systemic effects on communities. Understanding women's work experiences requires a paradigm shift in our conceptualization of women's unpaid work that moves us beyond a narrow focus on relations between men and women within the private household to one that expands our focus to include the unpaid work of women whose collective activism challenges racial, ethnic, national, caste, and class-based injustices. Feminists have articulated the need to make visible, to quantify, and to assign value to the non-market work that women perform within the household. This logic must extend to the site of the community where racialized and marginalized women often perform unpaid, non-market work because their communities lack sufficient access to public and private sector resources, and because of actions taken by the public and private sectors that threaten the well-being and the safety of community members. This represents an unjust work burden, not only of gender, but also of race, ethnicity, and social class or caste position. Making women's collective non-market work visible enables us to theorize women's oppression and exploitation in a manner that is inclusive of the lives of racialized women. It allows us to more fully and carefully theorize social relations within and across the different sites of production or sectors of the economy, and to have a better sense of the amount and type of work that people actually perform. And finally, this framework calls for the need to think through the impact of macroeconomic policies, not only in terms of their gender effects, but also on their racial ethnic effects. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to move on to Q&A. So if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll ask them. Jeff or Annie, did you want to lead the Q&A for this? If not, I'll do it. All right.
Yeah, I'll lead it for a couple of minutes. I just had a lot of background noise currently.
Yeah. Good.
Right. So, what an interesting topic to be writing about.
Thank you.
Like all this unseen work is just so baffling. Like there's present issues, like immigration and all these, which aren't novel or anything, but they seem to be more pressing right now. And I'd like to ask if how can we remodel the approach that these pioneering Black women employed to create a productive voice in their own communities to address these new racialized community issues, such as gentrification in urban areas?
So the work that I'm focusing on, I guess what I want to say is that I think of your question in the context of the solidarity framework, right? Which is a way of women coming together and creating a new type of economic arrangement. The way that I would answer your question in terms of my framework is that there are probably women who are dealing with the effects of gentrification. I don't know of specific examples. Again, and in the paper, Mary Pardo referred to this as unseen or unrecorded politics in the context of Chicanas. And so I think that it's also unrecorded work and unrecorded politics in the case of African Americans as well in terms of gentrification, right? But I imagine that there are women who are working together collectively to try to come up with ways to avoid being displaced through the process of gentrification. And I gave a talk yesterday morning on a radio show, and it focused on cooperatives. And even though my work doesn't deal with cooperatives, it talks about cooperation. The host told me about an example of people in Crenshaw who are trying to come up with cooperative solutions to reinvest within the community so that people who have been living there who are predominantly Black and of, I suppose, low and modest income can be able to maintain their homes, right? And again, they're focusing on cooperative models. So I don't know of any specific examples, right? But you know, people are coming together to deal with gentrification. And in a way that will try to benefit people within the community.
Okay.
Right.
Jeff, you want to continue going?
Yeah, I'll go with one more. So do you think that the social media has set a fear in employers and have caused them to evaluate their workspaces and create a safer environment for Black women or people who want to start these cooperatives in their communities?
You know, my work deals with the informal work that is not part of cooperatives, you know, which is, these are registered, co-ops are registered businesses. So I can't speak to workplace activities because my analysis is informal work that's not, you know, it doesn't involve buying and selling activities.
Okay, here's another question. This one is one that we thought up before the talk, but your story of researching a subject that wasn't explored by many is inspiring. How does one stay motivated while working on a research paper whose subject hasn't been explored in detail?
It's a good question, right? Because economics is a discipline where people tend to, you know, tweak the same model, right? And I think that it's a discipline that is subject to groupthink. And so doing work that really is outside of what other people are doing, and there's nobody else who's doing this work in economics, it does present a lot of challenges. And that's also true of my work on Sadie Alexander. Nobody else is doing that kind of work in terms of you know, excavating this early Black woman economist. And I would say I have been able to stay focused on this work because I believe that it's important. And I know the value of the work that Black women have always performed and, you know, historically performed and continue to perform. So, right. So even though there are things that have been discouraging, the difficulty to get this work published, for example, it's valuable work. And so that's the motivation to keep up with it and to keep at it.
Okay, this actually leads me to this other question. So given your experience in your research on the history of Black and marginalized women, as the newly appointed president of the National Economic Association, what are your plans?
One of the things that I would like to do for this association is to increase, I think, the visibility of it. And that is a challenge I'm finding because those of us who are members of it, when we give speaking engagements or talk to the media, we're often listed according to our institutional affiliation and not listed in terms of our association with the National Economic Association. And so surprisingly, there are a lot of people who aren't aware that there is an association of economists. And economists are people who have PhDs in economics or master's degrees, perhaps in economics as well. But there's a tendency to overlook Black economists. And so my hope is to be able to increase the visibility of economists who are Black and the work that we are doing.
Awesome. Okay. So sticking to textbooks economics and having a myopic view has led us to believe that the Black community can improve with access to education. And, you know, we've seen in the past that a lot of the times there is no access to education. There's little funding in education. We still see that today in communities, in poor communities. So even today, with more Black university students, the employment opportunities they're coming away with is still very poor. Is this because of the inherent sort of racism that still exists in hiring processes? And how can we correct these racial biases?
And you know, that is a really hard question. So one thing I would say to do is to look at the work of Valerie Wilson at the Economic Policy Institute, because she focuses on, you know, issues of the racial disparities between Blacks and whites in terms of earnings. And her research has documented that even when African Americans are able to, you know, do all the right things in terms of obtaining higher levels of education, that the gap continues, right? Right, and so it's a big problem. What do we do? I think we need to have better enforcement of anti-discrimination legislation. I think for people who have historically been excluded within the United States, most definitely African Americans, there is a need to actually have a return to affirmative action in employment, you know, and again, I'm talking about people who have historically been excluded. I don't think that we have much affirmative action based on employment or even admissions to colleges and universities anymore, right? So affirmative action, I think, is effective, but we also need to have monitoring and compliance with anti-discrimination legislation. I think it needs to be easier for people to be able to bring a complaint against an employer, and so that there's not a heavy burden on them to demonstrate that there is employment discrimination, right? So I think that that is really key. I think that affirmative action is an important part of it, and that government monitoring and enforcement is another key part of it.
All right, awesome. Yeah, I wish it were easier. Kind of just seems like a lot of the things that we've been trying to do, it just seems to not happen. Next question I have is, can you enlighten us about how you see the role of cooperatives as a way to count and value the unpaid community activism and provide services to women and children that governments have neglected to provide?
How do I see the role of cooperatives providing services?
As a way to count and value the unpaid community activism and provide services to women and children that governments have neglected to provide.
So what I'm going to do is reframe that around the work that I'm doing, right? And the argument that I'm making, rather than focusing on cooperatives, right? I'm going to focus that question around my argument, which is this unpaid work that women are doing collectively, racialized, marginalized women are doing collectively, that we need to see it, and that we need to quantify it, right? So if we think about the work that women are doing within the private household, and the way that feminists count that work, there are challenges there. There's, you know, the activities that take place in the household are overlapping, women are multitasking, but the really big challenge in terms of placing a market value on the work that women do within the household is that the market undervalues that work because of gender-based discrimination and racial discrimination as well. So when we apply a market value, such as the value, the pay that would be equivalent for a daycare worker to the work that is performed within the household, we are undervaluing it. Okay, so that's one of the challenges in terms of the household framework. The challenges for the kind of work that I'm talking about, collectively performed, unpaid, non-market work, is that, again, first we have to see it, and I'll give you an example about that in a moment. But when we then, come up with the market-based equivalent work, so if we're talking about people who are, going around their community and collecting health information, right? And if we come up with a market equivalent to that, we can attach a market value to it, and we can figure out the, the value of this work that is performed. The value that we come up with is also an underestimate of the true value, because it's not possible to place a monetary value on something like racial justice, if that's achieved, for example. So that's one of the issues. And then the other issue is, again, I'm talking about unpaid work that is performed in because of disparities, harms, right? And that is negative. So it operates the way that we would think about harm to the environment, right? And I'm sure you've been thinking about this in your group. And so the gross domestic product can't capture that, right? Because it's negative, the harm to the environment. So you need a different indicator, which would be the genuine progress indicator that subtracts the value of resources that are depleted, right? In order to assess the impact on social welfare. Same thing, the same logic applies to the work that I'm talking about as well, because it's a negative. So if we calculate the value that they are producing, because it's negative, people are being, harmed in the process of having to, live in these environments with tremendous racial disparities. So you subtract the value from the genuine progress indicator.
All right. Annie's currently writing a question. This kind of goes into unpaid labor. I know we focused a lot on this, of course, last semester in our feminist economics class, but this one is, when should I ask this? Like, do you think no, I'll go to another one then. Okay, so what should fundamentally change in order for Black women to receive the economic rights that they deserve?
In the context of what I'm talking about, and again, it's not just African-American women, right? If we look across the United States, Indigenous women face a tremendous amount, Indigenous people, right? I mean, I'm talking about it in terms of the work that women are performing collectively, but these disparities are felt throughout the entire community. So the solution is to address the disparities, the unmet needs, the harms to the community, whether it's, we're thinking about over-policing a lot these days, whether it's over-policing the criminal justice system, or living in a food desert, for example, or the environmental toxins. I give you an example that I talked about briefly yesterday on the radio program, which I think really illustrates this process, is that after the New York Times profile came out, a lawyer in DC contacted me, and he did pro bono work for an organization in Delaware. I think it's called Coalition for Education Reform. For a number of years, he and his team did pro bono work because Black children, primarily Black boys, were being dumped into a special needs program. And so when I read the article on him in this magazine, it was a really nice profile. It estimated the value of his pro bono work as $1 million over this period of time. And then I thought about it some more, and so I contacted him again, and I asked if the members of the Coalition for Education Reform were Black, and he wrote back and he said yes, that they were Black women, primarily Black mothers. So this is a good example of what I'm talking about. We see him, right, the lawyer, the well-paid lawyer who's highly educated, but we don't see the Black women, the moms, who are probably low income and who were doing a lot of the initial work to collect data and to be able to document this injustice that was taking place within their community over, a decade or so. And about 1,000 Black children were being dumped into this place, right? And so the argument is that if we can figure out the value of his pro bono work and look at him, he's visible, then we need to make the work of the Black women who are dealing with the educational system and the racism in the educational system, their work visible and also count it in terms of the value and the contribution that they are making. Again, but it's a negative, so we would subtract it from the genuine progress indicator.
Well, sadly, we're running out of time. I wish we had more. I wanted to, Professor Bishop. Okay, I'll ask this one more and then we'll end our session for the evening and I'll give the outro for this. So Professor Bishop is asking, there's been a disproportionately negative effect of the pandemic on women and communities of color. How far has this set us back in our fight for gender and racial equality, and what is the way out?
It has set us back far, right, in terms of loss of Black businesses. And so that's a source of wealth. Loss of homes is a source of wealth. Loss of jobs. I don't know how far back it has set us, but I imagine that it has set us back along, for a lengthy period of time. But the way that, I actually started to disengage with all the things that I have been reading since the summer about all of these crises that have been going on, because I felt it as a trauma. And so for me, this has just been a really traumatic experience, not only in a monetary sense in terms of loss of jobs and the wealth effects, which are tremendous. And I think that it's going to have intergenerational effects, but from an emotional standpoint, in terms of loss of lives, that's something that we can't put, a monetary estimate on. And so the effect has been and is devastating, and it's going to be devastating for some time.
All right, since it's about 6 o'clock, we are going to have to say goodbye. So on behalf of the Department of Social Sciences, Human Services, and Criminal Justice, the Economics Program, and the Economics Equality and Environment Academic Club, we'd like to thank Dr. Nina Banks for being here this evening to talk about the economics of Black women's unseen community activism amidst her incredibly busy schedule. I know I reached out to you last semester and you were very busy last semester as well. So I'm very happy that you were able to make some time to come in this semester to talk with us.
Thank you, Rochelle. It's been a pleasure to be able to talk to your group.
I'd also like to thank Jeff. I know he had a lot of background noise and a lot going on. He was supposed to do the Q&A, but I had to take over him. But thank you, Jeff, for helping create the questions and for helping with the Q&A. Thank you, Annie, for controlling everything behind the scenes. Thank you, Professor Brias, for helping us and motivating us to do the seminar series. So we know that spring break is right now. So we hope everyone stays safe and stays healthy. And we'll have more talks in the future, of course. We want to continue this. If you want more information, you can email us at bmcceeclub@gmail.com. Sorry. I'll put that in the chat for y'all. So anyways, thank you all for tuning in, and we hope that you have a wonderful evening, and I hope to see you and talk to you again soon. Dr. Banks, thank you so much.
You're wonderful. You're doing wonderful work. Thank you very much for having me.